Phesto is a member of the Oakland-based hip-hop collective Hieroglyphics and the group Souls of Mischief, who is known for his fast-paced and incredibly complex rhyming technique. This interview was done a few years ago as part of a research project which ultimately led to the idea for this podcast, and it was a huge privilege to talk with him, and I'm so grateful to have had him share his personal experiences and his knowledge of music theory, history and culture. Among many topics explored throughout the interview, Phesto discusses his early musical influences and experiences, how hip-hop became an integral part of his life, different ways in which people engage with and are affected by music, as well as some scientific and theoretical background that helps us to understand these phenomena. And of course, he discusses the iconic song 93 Til Infinity. So here's the interview, and I hope you enjoy and gain something from it.
Yo, what's happening?
Not much, man. How you doing? You all right?
Yeah, I'm doing great, man.
Good. Thanks again so much for doing this as well, by the way. Really appreciate it.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
The study, like I said, it was about music and well-being and kind of going beyond the surface to explore, the ways music affects us and how aware are we of that, the extent of which music can affect us in different ways. First question I'd want to ask is, when you think of the words music and well-being together, what are the first things that come to your mind from your own personal experiences?
The words music and well-being. Well, I think back on the way hip hop made me feel the first time I heard it. That's what it really makes me think of. Even though my experience with music predates hip hop, I would say. Some of my most euphoric, I guess, kind of moments were realizing that hip hop was like our thing. I couldn't really relate to music as much beforehand because all the music that I listened to was like my parents' music, And so it's tough. It's difficult to put in words because it's at such a young age, you don't really understand that. It's more of like something in retrospect you look back on and you say like, wow, I was really, these memories I still carry with me today.
Yeah.
And so they must have been monumental. But just like hearing like, Jam on It or like looking for the perfect beat, like breakdancing to those songs on the porch, overcome with this feeling of joy. And so I think that gets the serotonin going in the brain, and it's like when you run and when you get out in the sunshine and you feel the breeze, and that's the same kind of effect music can have on you. And then my parents throwing parties when I was little. I remember we had a downstairs area to my room to my house where there was like a pool table down there, and that's where the adults would kind of congregate. Uh-huh. And we would sneak down there sometimes and peek our head in to see what they were doing. And sometimes we look down and we see, people dancing, the DJ down there doing whatever, and just like seeing the effect that music had on other people, even if you didn't really know what it was giving to you.
But you were witnessing that.
We were witnessing it, and this was a breath of fresh air, and people escaping kind of like the hardships of whatever their reality was at the time, and music kind of taking you out of that reality into another state. And so it's kind of like, I feel like music kind of moves us through these dimensions in a way that we don't really know that we don't understand what's really happening, but it is. It's like it's taking us from one place, one mental state, to like a sort of a spiritual place.
Yeah. So what kind of stuff were you brought up on? What were your parents into? Was it the Motown and
Motown, Al Green, I mean, Hugh Masekela was playing in my house, and Lonnie Liston Smith and Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson, and so everything from funk to soul to a little reggae here and there, and jazz and more straight ahead jazz, but also some like more avant-garde stuff, like experimental stuff, like in the vein of like Bitches Brew and things like that. We're also playing in the house. So I heard the Way Out stuff, and then I also heard the, My Girl and the Temptations and things like that before I started to play my stuff, which was like early on for me. It was like, Slick Rick and Dougie Fresh, or my parents had the Sugar Hill Gang records. So that's some of the first hip hop I discovered was actually through my parents. They had Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and all that. And even though they weren't big, huge hip hop proponents, for some reason they took to that. My dad was just a person who just liked to buy records, so whatever was hot at the time, we're talking late 70s here, or 78, 77, 78, 79, around that time. Music started to get really experimental, in terms of like, you might not be in a disco, but you would just buy a disco record because maybe Barry White did a disco record, or some other artist who that wasn't their thing, but it was like, because disco was becoming big, certain artists, just like a Diana Ross did a disco record, or somebody like that who wasn't, they're known for a whole other genre of music, but they started dabbling in these other forms. And so maybe they looked at hip hop a little more in that vein. Like, this is a new experimental thing, so let me kind of jump in and see what it's like. Yeah.
Because around that time, I always compare, like, the emergence of hip hop over there was similar to how punk kind of emerged over here, because it was at a time where the younger generation was starting to realize they were kind of being forgotten about or left behind in certain ways. They were trying to be heard, basically. I don't know if that was the same for you guys growing up.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say it spoke to us in a way that, because what we saw you got to realize, like, at that time, there wasn't a lot of videos. And there wasn't, and so the radio, maybe one or two stations played hip hop in Northern California, right? I believe LA had K-Pool going on at the time, and K-Day. And then obviously we had K-Pool going on. They had K-Day going on down there. There was no hip hop didn't hit college radio until later. So these are just, like you're talking about Cal X and KZSU and those stations that were like college radio, those came way later. So in the early to mid 80s, you had really, really one station out here, K-Pool. And the main station, KMEL, which is now like the flagship hip hop station in the Bay Area and has been for the last 25 years. They didn't play hip hop. They played AC/DC and Pink Floyd and Aerosmith and, pretty much like pop rock and things of that nature. You might hear Hall and Oates or Culture Club and stuff, so maybe something like that on there. But they weren't playing hip hop as you wouldn't turn on KMEL and hear the Fat Boys or Houdini or Curtis Blow on there.
So when did that start? Probably like very early 90s or maybe late 80s.
I want to say Run DMC. They weren't the first because you got to realize Curtis Blow went platinum.
Wow.
Yeah, he's the first one. So if I'm not mistaken, but my data shows that he was the first one.
If you say it, I'll put my money on it. So,
and if he's not the first, he's the second. So, maybe Sugar Hill Gang or something like that. I don't know. But Sugar Hill Gang was definitely one of the first, Curtis Blow, Sugar Hill Gang. But it really exploded when Run DMC. I feel like Run DMC is what blew open the doors. And then LL shortly after that, because I Need Love, even though it was looked at as like, oh, there's this kind of love song that's like, really, really towing the line here. It was definitely looked at as a hip hop song. I mean, you got the donkey rope and the Kango on. It's hip hop. You know what I mean? So, but they had mixed shows that played, all the Soul Sonic Force stuff and basically what I term now is like breakdance music, pop lock.
I was going to say, I remember you guys saying in the documentary how hip hop wasn't really formed. Like, no one called it hip hop then, I don't think, did they?
I mean, they called it. The name existed. The name existed, but no one was like, if you're a break dancer, you're just automatically hip hop, or if you're a graffiti artist, you're just automatically hip hop. Even though all of these things there was an intersection there, I feel like it just never really, people never really made too big of the deal out of it. so to say, you know. And I think the culture formed, you know, in the 70s, but it was still not like pop culture by any means.
Yeah.
You know, it was still a subculture. And just just super underground, and like not like looked at as a passing fad. You know, it'd be like if something came in today and people are like, oh, that's gonna go out of style next year. And then it just keeps going and keeps going.
I couldn't help laughing just at that thought. Obviously, back then, you know, you never know where something's going to go, but it's crazy that you said that, and then, you know, look where we are 35, 40 years later.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right. I mean, you had like all like I know for sure my dad was like, that's a phase, it's gonna be gone, and it's gonna, you know, it's not gonna stick around because, you know, they grew up on people singing ballads and dance, and, you know, pretty much dance music, which hip hop was still at that time. But I don't think they could have ever imagined, like, I just came from something right now where it was like, you know, 45 people out there just watching somebody play beats on a laptop. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think,
crazy.
You know, nobody's dancing, you know, people drinking iced coffee and there's, you know, and buying, you know, buying it from like it was like a vinyl swap meet type thing, you know.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about how, you know, you said you were younger and you kind of peeked into that room to see what was going on, and you described the sort of euphoric feeling that you had. So I was going to ask, have you witnessed any effects of music, good or bad, on other people that didn't quite understand or know what was going on? Like, you knew something was going on, but have you become any more wise to or any more knowledgeable on what these effects are? I mean, you know, you've talked about the neurological, like the serotonin and things, but is there anything you're still left with a bit of a question about, like, you know, why does it affect us in this or that way?
And years ago, I read this book called Your Brain on Music, and it was written by and it was it's been a long time, so I'm kind of drawing a blank on the author's name, but he was a neurologist, but he was also a musician. So he was talking about how certain chords and certain keys make us feel, you know, evoke these different emotions within us, and why, and I mean, just getting really scientific with it.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, you know, and it made me think like, oh, okay. So when, you know, people say like a minor key is like, has more of a melancholy feel, or could feel a little more down. And then when you're on a sharper, you know, major key, it has like a happier tone. And even when you break down each particular note, like a D minor chord is going to make you feel a certain way versus a D major chord, and all these different things. Like, there's colors related to each chord. Even like people are like, oh, C is a yellow, you know, and
I've heard people say
and A minor is a purple, and, you know, like they have it like broken down to a color spectrum, which is pretty interesting. But
I'm definitely gonna have to try and find that book.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I just think it's, even if it's not completely factual, it's like, it's just entertaining at the very least.
I guess so. I mean, this is the kind of direction I want to take it though. Like, in the same way how, you know, our dieting and exercise is so influenced by science now, you know, in everyday life, you know, people are monitoring all sorts of things. And I'm curious to know if we can do that with music as well, and how, if we can engage more consciously with music. So not just to say, or to cheer up, put Bob Marley on, like, you know that's going to work, but what is it about the song or the tone or whatever it might be that has that effect? But I'm definitely going to check that book out and see what he's got to say.
I mean, and that's speaking in like traditional music terms. So when you're speaking on hip hop would take on its own sort of story, right? Because it's different than a Bob Marley, or in the sense that it's all music, so it's relative. But I think hip hop, it sort of defies theory, right? In a way, because a lot of I mean, unless you just have like loop based music where it's just like you took a sample from a certain record and you looped it, and then you added some drums to it, and that's going to have a certain vibe and a similar vibe to whatever. Let's take 93 Til Infinity.
I was waiting for
example. If you listen to the original composition by Billy Cobham, it's, I want to say the BPM is down around maybe 70 or so, maybe even 60. Because what we used to do to save sampling time is, I've told this story before, is you turn the turntable from 33 rotations per minute to 45, right?
Yeah.
And that speeds up the record, and that makes you able to sample the piece you're trying to get with less in a shorter amount of time. So it saves you sampling time, saves you disk space when you're sampling to these hardware samplers that we used to use. None of that matters anymore today because you got infinite sampling time, or however big your computer hard drive is. But back in the day, we used to have to try to save time. So what we would do was we would put the record on 45 so that we could sample the record in a shorter amount of time. Yeah. That record was, and you would just leave it on 45 a lot and just, go back and forth sometime too. But 93 Til Infinity is one of those records that was on 45 and it sped up tremendously. I'm saying all this to say the speed of a record can change the feeling. And so if the speed of the record can change the feeling, I guess, if obviously there was stuff added and filtered and all that kind of stuff to change it as well, but just the speed of the record gave it this other kind of feel. And it's a melancholy kind of loop anyway, but something about it sped up.
So much more optimistic, I feel.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about hip hop out the gate, a lot of the hip hop out the gate was like up tempo, because it was about the break beat, it was about that breakdown, and it was about making the b-boys
get moving,
keep people dancing. Yeah, that's what DJing is. DJing is all about, was at least all about keeping people dancing, you know what I mean? So a certain tempo had to be achieved to like get people to dance, because when you play music slow, people are like, oh, what do I do with this? Do I slow dance with this? But that just speaks to like all the different factors that can change the mood of the music, which change the emotion that's evoked from the.
I was thinking one of the rare examples where I think this sample wasn't changed too much was Cream, because it was just 5 seconds at the beginning of that song.
Yeah.
And when I found the original, I kept waiting for it to come later again in the song, but it was just the first 5 seconds over and over. And then you compare that to, I don't know, like Check the Rhyme. I think that had 7 different things layered on, throughout that track.
Yeah. Or you take like a Premiere to me is like the master of the one beat sample, or two beat sample, where it's just 1 or 2 meters and he chops it and then down pitches it or whatever he does to modify it, and it becomes this whole other thing.
Yeah.
So when you listen to Gangstar records, like, he does use some loop based stuff, but a lot of it is really, he rarely is like, he's not like a Pete Rock who might sample a 4-bar loop and then filter that and add some things or subtract from it or whatever to change it, So that's, I guess, going back to the initial question, is like, hip hop is so different from these other forms of music that you can say like, oh, if you throw on the Temptations or you throw on Ohio Players or something like that, any like funk based stuff from those days, that evokes a certain emotion because of just the melody and things like that, where hip hop is not really a melodic like that all the time. So you see people screw face in the corner when Griselda's on. It's like, here's this beat with no drums, and it's like some like atonal sample that's looping, and people are just like, oh, yo, that's sick. That does something totally different than someone playing a 1-4-5 change on a guitar. So I mean, this is a vast subject that you're tackling. I mean, you're going to navigate this thing where you're going to go, obviously, but it's like, if you understand, I think, traditional music in the way that evokes a certain, that's already been documented.
Yeah.
Right. Like the major keys make us feel this way, and the minor keys and the diminished keys and all these different. If you understand theory, that's a great
foundation
database to kind of go from. foundation to go from. And then once you understand that, I feel like you start venturing off into understanding jazz and why, like, oh, when jazz first came out and people were playing that diminished sixth, they started saying that was like the devil's music and all that kind of stuff. Why? Because everything else before that was always, tension, resolution, tension, resolution, tension, resolution. And then they started going tension, tension, resolution. And then people were like, oh man, it's too, and so like, then you ended up with these like, my son calls them, because I'm teaching my son piano, he calls them scary chords. But I say, actually, that's just a diminished chord, and people use it for a change, and they use it a lot in jazz music. And so when you started adding more color to your chords, all classical music was mostly triads. That basically means three tones, three voices, and that was, and a lot of it was just two voices, really just your one and your five. Like if you listen to Bach and Beethoven and those people, and then they started adding more voices. Then that's why when jazz came around and started adding even more color to those chords, people were like, "Oh, what's going on here? This is not,"
I think
because a lot of
anything to a lot of people, anything that maybe goes against the status quo or just what they're used to. Some people are just so averse to the unfamiliar and the new things a lot of the time. I think that's.
But not only that, a lot of that stuff came from the church. Like the modes come from even people say they call them the modes. So if you look up the modes, you'll see, the Aeolian, the Ionian, the Mixolydian, the Phrygian, the Lydian. These are all the Dorian. The Dorian mode is, if you listen to like jazz, if you listen to "So What" by Miles Davis. So What is it's like one of Miles Davis's most famous songs, right? So What? So Bill Evans is playing the piano, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Cannonball Adderley are all the soloists on that song. So it's one of the most, if you take harmonic analysis in college, they're going to have you analyze that song and break down the chords and why they did this change here and that thing. And they use something called the Dorian mode, right? And the Dorian mode is, if you go into music, you say, okay, if you're in C major, you're going to go from C to C, you're going to play all the white keys. Well, the Dorian mode would be you go from D to D and you play all the white keys. So it's a different formula for that, for those scales. And that's Miles Davis is kind of one of the, I'm not going to say forefathers because it existed before him, but one of the people that made it sort of cool.
Yeah.
And and that's the name of the album too, right? Is the birth of cool, right? So cool jazz is the Dorian mode, basically. But all these other modes, like if you look up the Phrygian mode, you'll hear like a lot of Pink Floyd and a lot of more rock, like it's more of a guitar based sort of scale that guitarists use in rock. And so I think if you understand a lot of that stuff, and people get bored to death with theory, but I happen to love it. Especially with hip hop, it's good to know those rules because we don't use any of them, but it's good to know like if it'll ever apply, or how far outside the rule you are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think that if you understand a little bit of that, that can help you understand some of the effects that those different, why a song sounds a certain way and why it evokes that emotion. Yeah.
I think that's going to definitely lead me on a big, lead me down a
big rabbit hole.
Yeah,
jumping down the rabbit hole there.
I like this phrase, the music that we listen to is the soundtrack to our life. Has the music that you listen to and that you create, has that made you realize anything about yourself over the years, as you've progressed or, in hindsight, looking back?
Probably the biggest thing, I think it's just that it's infinite. You know what I mean? Like you're never at the end. It's always developing. No. So what it's taught me is even in everyday things that I do, it's more about the process than it is like the end result. You know what I mean? Like even making an album, like I go back and sometime every now and then I listen to my old stuff and I won't say I appreciate it anymore or any less, but it makes me realize that when I'm there in that moment creating, it's just like I'm just in that moment. You know what I mean? And that's the greatest part about it, is the presence. You know, we did a record with Adrian Young called There Is Only Now.
Yeah.
And I just really thought about that title for a long time. After we came up with the title, I was like, wow, there is only now. Like, that's what music sort of does for you. It puts you in that place. You're not thinking about tomorrow. You're not thinking about the day before. You're only thinking about that process at the time. And it's not about like, because you can't even affect, even by what you're doing right there, you can't even affect the outcome really.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just going to come out the way it comes out. You know what I'm saying? It's not like every time we try to say we're going to do this and it's going to do this is going to be the end result. Yeah, we get close, but it never, like, it's always something completely different. And that's super cool. You know, if you look historically, like, a lot of the best records have been made when people just were like not trying too hard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They just were like, we're going to do it. We're going to have fun. Oh yeah. How much? We got 15 minutes left in the session. What do you guys want to do? Oh, just throw on that beat you made last night, or just, you know, with a band, like, oh, just start playing a groove. And then the bass player just starts playing something. And then the keyboardist jumps on top, and then they make it in like, 5 minutes. And it's like the greatest thing they've ever done. And like, just how like Mistakes, like Top Billing by Audio 2. It's just a staple in hip hop for me. Like, it's just like, as far as the drums, in the way that like when people start, like when they have like beatbox competitions, people do that.
It's always that one.
More chilling. What more chilling? What more can I say? Top Bill. That was a mistake. He messed the sequence up and accidentally I think he put that that kick was actually supposed to be the hi-hat, and he switched them around on accident. So he made a mistake and was like, oh, yo, that sounds cool like that. That happens a lot in music. Like, you'll be doing something and you'll accidentally stumble, you'll make a mistake, and it's like, no, leave it like that.
Yeah.
And that ends up adding the whole like character to it and the color to it that it needs to make it stand out,
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that also ties into that whole idea of just be in the moment. And I take that down to the take. I tell myself I'm gonna do 3 takes, and I'm just gonna do my best on each take, and I'm just gonna live in these takes. I'm not gonna worry about, like, if I'm gonna take the mistakes and I'm gonna live with them. It's kind of hard to like say you in words like how that ties into being in the moment, but it's like, I think if you're in the moment, you're going to evoke this emotion and this feeling that translates itself in a way that doesn't when you're trying to be so perfect. You know what I mean?
Just when it's right, it's right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Has there been anything that's surprised you looking back at your journey and how you've developed as a creator of music? Like, either looking at your past self or seeing where you are now?
I would say I'm surprised whenever I do exactly what I'm trying to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, when I'm like, I'm gonna do this and I want it to sound exactly like this. You know what I mean? And it ends up happening.
How often is that
then? It happens every blue moon. It's definitely not something that happens all the time. And it's not something that I've learned now, like, to just let my ears sort of dictate where I go, as opposed to like my head. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes sometimes you overthink it, and now I'm just like, I'm more in the mode of like, throw paint at the canvas and see what sticks. Yeah. So I am surprised. That's why I'm surprised when it comes out exactly the way that I intended, because it's, I try to have as organic an approach as possible, because I could do 100 takes and get it just right. But then I would be like, those extra minutes that I used to get it exact right, I could have moved on and made something and added a change or got done another song. Yeah.
I've heard people say that before. I've heard someone in a band say the same thing. Like, he did a perfect take the first time, but in his head, he was chasing that thing. He was chasing some kind of ideal in his head, and he was doing it for probably 2 hours, and he could never get it as good as it was that first time. So
yeah, that happens too. Like, you'll be like, I've done stuff where I've done verses. I've been trying to do a verse, and I've been there like all day, and finally I just say, and I go back and listen to like the first or second take, and it was better than the last take.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So, you gotta just, I mean, I feel like almost, this is probably like exaggerating, but almost anybody can make a record if somebody just lets you do 1,000 takes. If I could give you, like, you probably never played the trumpet. I could give you a trumpet right now, and if you just did 1,000 takes, and I said, oh, play C flat, D, and E, and F sharp, and you could, and I showed you the notes and how to do it, you could do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But somebody who really is proficient in the instrument would do it in 2 minutes and be on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So that's what it's all about, is like training yourself to be able to do it proficiently and maximizing that time as well.
Yeah, that definitely.
So that's why you practice. That's why you say 10,000 hours. So those 10,000 hours are supposed to be you practicing, not doing takes. You're not supposed to spend 10,000 takes.